All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining Political Research Associates today for a roundtable discussion on Election Eve, a State of Democracy report. Today's discussion is the last in a six-part series that has ranged from an evaluation of militia mobilization in the US to austerity politics in the face of the pandemic-induced recession, to a global look at the relationship between authoritarianism and misogyny. Before we begin, I want to express mine and PRA's heartfelt gratitude to those of you who have tuned in for multiple webinars in this series. We at PRA believe strongly in the power of informing our resistance across social justice movements, and producing this kind of public programming is a way for us to directly connect with our audiences and partners on issues that are core to PRA's mission, values, and expertise. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time today, Political Research Associates is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. Today, a mere 5 days before Election Day, we are diving into a retrospective of the last 4 years under President Trump, what we are preparing for with this contentious and high-stakes election, and what movements on the right are deserving of our attention moving into the next 4 years. For this discussion, we are joined by Tamara Tolles O'Laughlin, Advocate for People and Planet and North American Director of 350.org, Carl Williams, Adjunct Professor of Law at Cornell University, PRA Assistant Research Director Stephen Gardner, and Senior Research Analyst Frederick Clarkson. Thank you all for joining us today. We will go ahead and get started with our first question. On Tuesday, this Tuesday of this week, we explored one movement on the Christian right that has been particularly influential in the Trump administration, Christian Zionists, largely under the mantle of Christians United for Israel. With the understanding that the Christian right is not an organized monolith, Fred, what movements have been particularly successful under the past 4 years and stand to benefit from a second Trump term? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Thank you, Koki. It would not be an exaggeration to say that what the Christian right has been able to achieve during the Trump administration far exceeds what they'd hoped or expected decades ago when the movement in all of its manifestations began to gather focus and momentum. But let's just say right away, in politics and government, it's said that personnel is policy. So by that standard alone, Trump has delivered. Beginning with the cabinet, we initially had a Christian right federal senator, Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General. He was succeeded by a conservative Catholic, William Barr. Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, and HUD secretary, Ben Carson, were unambiguously Christian right figures. And let's not forget Mike Pence, who served on the board of the Indiana affiliate of the Family Research Council before he was elected governor of Indiana. Trump's Supreme Court appointments and Amy Barrett, a conservative charismatic Catholic, another conservative Catholic, and Brett Kavanaugh, and Neil Gorsuch, a member of a conservative schismatic Anglican church, have transformed the court as well as the federal judiciary in ways we've only just begun to see. So let's take one theme at the center of this. It was in 2009 that the Christian right leaders and conservative Catholic bishops signed the Manhattan Declaration, on which they agreed to rally on 3 matters, and these were life, marriage, and religious freedom in that order. We soon saw that most of the Christian right and key elements of the Catholic bishops emphasized these points in their public agenda. In deference to that, Mitt Romney specifically invoked them in his acceptance speech at the 2012 GOP convention. This has been a long time in coming. During the 2016 campaign, Trump spoke at the annual Values Voters Summit in Washington, D.C. I was there when he pledged to emphasize religious freedom in his administration. And this was important to this audience in part because he used to be pro-choice before he had a campaign conversion. And he'd also promised to uphold LGBTQ rights and had even held up a rainbow flag while saying it at the Republican convention. Since then, he's turned on the LGBT community and often in the name of religious freedom. We've seen this in the setting up of religious freedom sections of civil rights offices and federal departments. And these are mostly aimed at ensuring the ability of institutions to be able to declare religious exemptions from the generally applicable laws, which is to say, laws that apply to the rest of us in such matters as the equality of LGBTQ people and access to reproductive health care. But not only these, the National Labor Relations Board, stacked with Trump appointees, is increasingly carving out religious exemptions from labor laws for religiously affiliated colleges and universities. This has given the anti-labor right-to-work movement a 21st century twist. If what's passed is prologue, a second Trump term would see more of the same, as well as religious exemptions becoming cemented, not only in policies, but in law via the Trumpian courts. I would expect religious exemptions not only for institutions like Catholic universities to be expanded, but individuals as well, as people with conscientious objections, for example, to providing medical care to trans people, or to people or people who don't recognize the validity of same-sex marriages are all given a pass. So, but just a few quick points about what the Christian right has been up to this election season, which is worth mentioning as we go into the election. The Christian right was able a few years ago to get access to the entire national voter file, which had been leaked from a storage computer. They've since operated a sophisticated voter identification and targeting operation, which functions largely under the radar, particularly now that COVID limits in-person campaign activities. And I'd say this is a capacity that is not to be underestimated now and in the future. But Ralph Reed, best known for his days in the Christian Coalition, says that his newish organization, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, is focusing on the controversial technique of ballot harvesting in selected churches, and not just white evangelical churches, but increasingly into Hispanic and Asian churches. This diversification has been quietly been a theme for a few years now and defies the stereotypes about which we hear in the media. Now, before the COVID crisis, when people were mostly, where they mostly stopped going to church, political operatives from Catholic Vote, run by prominent pro-Trump Catholics, tracked the cell phones of people who attended Mass in order to gather data about their voter registration status and voting history to develop profiles for targeted outreach in swing states. This method is called geofencing, and it's been also used to identify and track white evangelical churchgoers as potential voters. So this kind of profound electoral organizing capacity will likely continue regardless of the outcome of the elections. So finally, one word about potential Christian right reactions to a Trump loss. This is tricky to navigate because of their practice of using strident and apocalyptic language, often threatening violence and civil war if they don't get their way. And it can be hard to know what to take seriously. We see some bleed over in the violent, with the violent neo-Confederates, such as the League of the South, which sees itself as defending Christendom, and going into Charlottesville had organized what they called the Army of the Living God. How much of this is posturing and scare tactics and how much is real is hard to say, and they relish the ambiguity. But going back at least to evangelical theologian Francis Schaeffer, there's been alarmed talk about the need to resist government tyranny, usually spelled in capital letters. But violence, while intermittent and certainly real, and the bombings of clinics and the assassination of doctors, has never amounted to much more than that. They talk big about emulating the American Revolution, but sometimes they go in another direction, evoking the nonviolent resistance of Martin Luther King. So just before the Supreme Court decision in Hobby Lobby in 2014, evangelical megachurch pastor Rick Warren told a Southern Baptist Convention gathering that the fight for religious liberty might bring persecution. He warned that this may require personal sacrifices. And so he said, invoking Martin Luther King, that this may take some pastors going to jail. I'm in. I willingly said it, I'm in. But such braggadocio notwithstanding, this is the kind of thing we hear a lot. It was present in the Manhattan Declaration, threatening civil disobedience. But to my knowledge, none of the signers, and certainly not Rick Warren, ever actually committed civil disobedience, let alone went to jail over anything ever.
Thank you, Fred. You covered a lot and really setting the stage for today's discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Shifting our focus to the judiciary, Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court nomination was confirmed this past Monday evening, granting conservatives a coveted 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. While the implications of a 6-3 SCOTUS majority loom large in our minds, Carl, can you give us a big picture look at what we've been seeing throughout the judiciary, particularly in the lower courts over the past 4 years?
Sure. I'm going to start off just in the Supreme Court, and then we can go down a bit. But the first thing I want to say is that the Supreme Court in itself is a conservative and reactionary institution, because what it does is uphold constitutional principles, which historically have been, and I mean, in the Constitution now, are statements of white supremacy, right? They exist in the Constitution, right? Black people are 3/5 of a human being. That was written into the Constitution. You actually can't edit things out of the Constitution. You can only add language to the Constitution. So that's still there, right? And it actually speaks indirectly about indigenous people, who are 0/5 of a human being in the Constitution. So any entity, any political body that is in a position to conserve the United States Constitution that's a conservative body, right? So the structure of the Supreme Court, even before it's peopled, is something that has a tendency towards a reactionary direction. So I want to start out there before we populate the Supreme Court. Now, thinking of the historic population of the Supreme Court, I think in our sort of different folks, different ages, lifetimes, we think of what the Supreme Court is. Historically, the Supreme Court has always, except for one, maybe say one brief shining period, right? The Supreme Court has always been populated by people with conservative ideals, right? Sometimes even fairly overtly racist ideals. So I think in recent history, maybe expanding that a little bit, we can think like, oh, there were some very good times where people had Fourth Amendment protections, saying, and Fifth Amendment protections, where the court said, you need to read a person their rights. You need to exclude evidence if you physically search. People have a right to have abortions. Those are much more the exception, I think, than the rule of progressive action taken by the Supreme Court and the federal courts in general. So disappointingly, I think, with the appointment of Justice Barrett, I think that's the first time I said that, with the appointment of Justice Barrett to the Supreme Court, we're sort of back to where we have been for most of the existence of the United States of America. So I think that's a disappointing, a sobering way to think about where we are. And I think importantly, it means we need to fight like hell, as we've always historically, and we've done this before, and we can certainly do it again. We can certainly exist in a very progressive, freedom-minded attitude, even though there is a court that is populated by reactionaries, just as Fred has just said. So I think that's the beginning piece. A thing that I want to differentiate here is people keep using the term court packing, and I keep hearing it on the news. I heard it on the bus a little while ago, and I look and I go, people mean two different things. Historically, when we've talked about court packing, it means expanding the size of some structure, of some judiciary, usually the Supreme Court, saying we're going to expand the size of the Supreme Court and put more people on that, right? So I think that is the most traditional understanding of court packing. Some people, I think, colloquially use it to mean filling a lot of, I'll say it in a colloquial way, filling a lot of vacancies on the court, which Trump has done because he was handed, his administration was handed, a bunch of empty spaces on trial level district federal courts, circuit courts, that's the middle set of courts, federal courts of appeal. He wasn't handed any on the United States Supreme Court, but those have been introduced by intervening events. So he has, I'm putting this in quotes for people just listening and not seeing me, but he has packed people, and very reactionary, very conservative people, suggested by actual lists that the Federalist Society, in conjunction with other very, very conservative, very reactionary organizations, have said, put this person on the court, put this person on the court, put this person on the court, and pulled up some other people from lower levels in the federal judiciary, people like Kavanaugh, and put them on the United States Supreme Court. So it's not a caution, but be aware when people use the term court packing, they're talking about commonly people are talking about several different things. And I don't think either term is more correct. One of them is the more precise historic usage, and that is enlarging a space on a court. It sounds like a lot of progressive Democrats are interested in this idea. People are probably fully aware that Joe Biden fairly deftly dodged answering that question, and we can only think if he's dodging answer that question, it's for one of two reasons: because he's trying to appease progressive Democrats, and then he's not going to do anything about it, or he's actually saying, I'm going to save this, for later because I might want to do it. I actually might want to do it, and I don't want to, get on a national or international stage and say, I'm never going to do that. I'm against the idea of enlarging the Supreme Court. And just for folks who might not know about the specific structure, might not know the specific structure of the United States Supreme Court, there is not a defined size for the United States Supreme Court in constitutionally. So that is something that can be created. I don't want to say it will, but that can be created. It could be enlarged, or seemingly could be contracted. Contracting it would be a complicated thing because you would have to do something about the judges who are appointed for life. But the fact that it is the size that it is now is not something that is set in. It's not carved in marble anywhere, and it's certainly not scripted in the United States Constitution as written. I think I'll leave it there, and we can get back to other pieces later.
Thank you, Carl. I'm sure more questions are going to come up, and I appreciate that look at starting the Supreme Court and then talking a little bit about lower courts as well. Tamara, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of Barrett's confirmation for climate litigation. Do you mind taking a minute to do that with us?
Sure. So I'll say, in the words of Jabari Breesport, who may have put out my favorite tweet on the court packing, expanding the court conversation, is pack the court, make it thick. To be quite frank, and part of why I found that particularly exciting is because it means we've already crossed over into the common nomenclature about the idea that we've done this 7 times already. It is not an unusual thing to rebalance the court, to think about who's in it, why they're in it, and what they represent. None of these are sacred texts. There's not a biblical thing about the assignment of who's in Congress, and there certainly isn't anything in the realm of any religious sacrosanct in the way that the courts are designed. So we really just need to step up and do our job to make sure it represents us. I do think for climate folks, this is especially painfully true, because as we are in the middle of the best last decade of our lives to do work on climate that will be meaningful, that will keep people from harm, that will make the numbers of people who die less, who experience trauma, COPD, asthma, heart attacks, you name it, who suffer from all of the things we could do something about. This is our time to do that in this decade. So thinking about how SCOTUS implicates climate, we have to recognize that the 40 judges that Trump has already put in are folks who are not going to be open to these questions, which means continuing lawsuits from ExxonNew to making them pay as municipalities start to look for who's going to pay the bill as climate change ruins everything, destroys the collective pot of resources, and takes down property like nobody's business. That will become a state level problem that becomes a state federal fight, which means it will go to the Supreme Court. And having judges who do not think about climate as a thing they have to come to terms with, do not have a theory of the case for how to respond to it beyond recognizing narrow viewpoints of damages, liability, and harm. We are going to have an expansive conversation in the public dialogue about what that means. And these kinds of questions end up at the Supreme Court. So if we don't have folks who believe in it, who have clear opinions on it, who read the science or will admit that they have done so in a public vetting of whether or not they're the right person for the job, yeah, it's a good time for us to be focused on who's taken those robes, because it isn't just about, sitting on a dais in a black dress. It's about being able to be responsive to what today's needs are and what the future will look like. So for climate folks, we're looking at SCOTUS as one of several litmus tests for whether or not the democracy can work for us and save us from dying on a fiery gas ball.
Thank you. I actually want to stick with you for a second, Tamara, before we move on to talking about the election. Can you walk us through what you think are the most impactful changes to climate change diplomacy legislation, executive orders and law in the past 4 years, and where you identify irreversible or lasting rollbacks have occurred, especially as you say, we're in our last decade of meaningful action?
Wow, I feel like the smorgasbord of things that has delivered us to this moment, all the things that have gone wrong. In the last 4 years, we've seen real damage done on Obama era limits on carbon dioxide emissions, so greenhouse gases from power plants, cars and trucks, protections that have been fought for by decades of activists. One of the things that came up by one of the other panelists was that we're in a 4-generation moment. We got 4 generations of people fighting not to die on a fiery gas ball, folks who started doing it because they wanted to save a tree and ended up with a job, and people who are looking at the future and don't see anything but debt and damages. So we got those 4 generations of people at the same time demanding that we respond to the fact that the nation's wetlands, I refer to them as the teeth of landscape, and when they go away, try to eat corn without your teeth. It's a lot more interesting for a number of reasons. But I would also say that, like, ripping out the wetlands, burning them and sacrificing them has made the inland terror of what happens in the ocean more of a problem. People are suffering as a result of it. And that is stuff that's happened on our watch in the last 4 years. The withdrawing of mercury emissions from power plants, methane regulation, I think is one of the most shameful things that has failed to happen in the last few years. States had every opportunity to wrestle with it as the federal government was nearing an answer, and both choked. So flagging other rollbacks that I'm really concerned about are wildlife protections. I mean, if you've ever talked to me before, you realize I don't stay up at night worrying about animals, because bears don't sit around tables wondering how to save me from climate change. That being said, like, we do have responsibility as a species that can, charismatic megafauna that can make changes for everybody else, to be responsible with what's ahead of us. And those are just like a couple of the things that I think this administration has been really responsible for that we haven't talked about, except to say we've been harmed in all these ways. Other things that I think are really clear to us is the fate of public lands. Even as we speak, public lands are being put on a chopping block for the creation of roads to create more opportunities for extraction, all of which are deeply inappropriate, particularly patriarchal ways of destroying the planet. So flagging that domestic oil production has been supported by this administration, consecutive years of fighting against all of the work that we've done to make emissions less of the target, so we could talk about people and planet. This administration has been fantastic in keeping its word, even sending a memo to everyone that the EPA will no longer engage in enforcement. For those of us who were deeply dissatisfied for the decades of enforcement that wasn't going on when people worked there who cared about it, this is a huge blow. So I do think that we're in a moment where with 10 years to go, we don't have another 4 years to waste. And so what we have lost is only a fraction of what we will continue to lose if we stay on this trajectory.
Thank you for another sobering look at where we are right now. With what we've just discussed in mind, Tuesday's election is arguably one of the highest stakes elections this country has seen in generations, and one of the most divisive. Stephen, can you detail some of PRA's most pressing concerns when it comes to Election Day and the weeks following? What are the worst case scenarios we as an organization are preparing for, and what should the public keep in mind come Tuesday to temper expectations, prepare for unrest, and look for in the coming weeks?
Really interesting question. Of course, we've got the stage set with Carl and Tamara and Fred of sort of how we have come to the point we are at. Of course, this is, as everyone has sort of indicated a decades-long process that has brought us here. It didn't start with Donald Trump, and it will not end with Donald Trump, regardless of what happens after Tuesday. And I'm going to say after Tuesday because the first thing I want to put on the table is that we do not anticipate, and neither do most of the expert opinion anticipate, that we are likely to know who the next president of the United States will be on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. And it may in fact take an extended period of time during which forces, political forces in this country are going to be arguing about this. There's going to be resistance regardless of what the initial tendencies are. It is quite possible that on election night and on Wednesday morning, it will appear as though Donald Trump is ahead in the results because of the ways in which votes are counted, and that is that the ones that are cast on election night may very likely be, or election day, may very likely be collated and counted before those that were cast by mail-in. And in this election, as in 2018, we have a strong prejudice bias towards Democrats being the ones who've requested mail-in ballots. And so we can anticipate that those ballots will be counted relatively late. This will become particularly important in battleground states, places like Pennsylvania and Florida, Michigan and Wisconsin, where the election will probably be decided. Pennsylvania in particular looks as though it could have an extended period of not knowing the results. And the fear is that between election day and inauguration, the Trump administration and its allies on the far right, and also in the courts and in all parts of the GOP apparatus that are willing to discount election results for victory, will say we need to stop counting the votes because, as Trump has set us up to believe, the vote, besides what happens on election day, will be so compromised with fraud, with individual voter fraud, that if we keep counting, it will amount to a coup. This will be a coup by the Democrats. And this message is going to be echoed in right-wing media as well as on the streets. The Christian right, as Fred said, will probably talk apocalyptic. The paramilitary right is already saying they will be out on the streets with guns on election day and perhaps after. They are anticipating seeing large crowds of protesters from center and left, some of those racial justice protesters who've been out for 4 months already, some of those protesters who will be coming out specifically to try to say, wait, make every vote count. Every vote that was cast should be counted. And they're anticipating seeing this as riots and looting and insurrection. It's been pre-programmed for them. Now, having said all of that, there's also a risk of overstating and seeing the whatever contentious action happens on the street. A lot of pro-democracy protesters and a smaller number, but still a significant number of Trump supporters yelling at each other is not civil war. That's messy politics. That happens, and we need to be prepared to see that emotionally, to have resilience for that going on night after night. And in that mix, of course, what's going to happen? Well, there are going to be incidents of provocation, some of them from the police, some of them from the right, some of them from people who are just fed up and tired with the instances of police violence, of racism in our society. And when that happens, there is potential for police intervention in First Amendment protected politics that on a scale that perhaps we have not seen for decades, even in the last several months, which has been a historic rise. So this is of concern. Another piece of concern, let me just backtrack a little bit and say, the interesting thing about the claim of voter fraud as a sort of foundation for saying we should stop counting the votes is that every credible study has said that while in fact individual voter fraud, someone voting once or voting when they're not actually eligible to vote, is a negligible problem. This has been studied over and over again, and out of the billion or so votes cast between 2000 and 2014, one study showed that a tiny fraction of 1% of cases were even brought forward as potential fraud. However, it's also at the same time been documented that voter suppression through the creation of gerrymandered districts and willfully putting people off the polls because they haven't voted recently, or suspicion that they're not using their right signature in this age when almost no one uses a standard signature anymore the way that it was historically interpreted. And these kinds of actions, put on top of which we now have the end of a consent decree with the Republican Party that allows them for the first time since the early 80s to send poll watchers, quote unquote, into the polls without permissions, explicit permission from a judge. All of these things taken together then lead to the possibility of the Trump administration and the Justice Department and the street leaning on Republican-dominated legislatures to attempt to exercise what would be a potential right within the Constitution to decide who the electors will be. Now, every legal opinion I've seen has said that you can't do this after the votes have been cast. This would be perfectly acceptable for a legislature with the votes under their state constitutions to make that kind of change. To, for example, for a legislature to say, we're going to select the legislature and bypass the vote. That would be okay under the Constitution. It might be politically very risky, but it would be okay under the Constitution. But the rules as they exist, and certainly the precedent as it exists, would suggest that you can't do that after the votes have been cast, except the change at the Supreme Court that we have seen over the last 4 years leaves this with lots of people shaking their heads and saying, well, what will happen if one or more Republican-dominated state legislatures in one of these key states says, no, we're going to stop counting these votes. We're going to assert our legislative authority over who the electors are, which again will be echoed and amplified on the street, from which already for months, elements of the paramilitary and militia right that are aligned with the Trump administration are calling for him to use the Insurrection Act to send federal troops or to nationalize the National Guard, federalize the National Guard, to intervene on street levels. And this would be, again, another element of giving political cover to these state legislatures to take this, what on the surface of it would be outrageous action of deciding who their state voted for and ignoring the total vote count. So those are some of the things that we are concerned about, keeping in mind that even if there's a clear Democratic victory early on, Trump is never going to concede. That is our presupposition. I'd be delighted to be wrong, but that is our presupposition. And his lack of concession in and of itself creates a problem in democratic succession, particularly as he is holding on to the reins of government power. And this is the way authoritarianism attempts to protect itself. Our only saving grace is that, at least so far, he has not been able to consolidate the kind of authoritarian power that his rhetoric would suggest he would like to have.
Thank you, Stephen. Sorry to make you the bearer of bad news today. Continuing this conversation, Carl, I'd like to ask you, what role do you see the courts playing in this election? Stephen's mentioned it a little bit, but both in worst case, best case scenarios, thinking back to 2000 when the Supreme Court weighed in on the presidential election leading to a Bush victory over Al Gore.
I think that and a bunch of stuff that we just heard is crucially important, because first we have to see what the facts on the ground are. And some of those we can make some good guesses at, right? Because historically what we've seen in other elections, mostly the 2000 election. And one of the things that I think, facts on the ground, a poignant moment from, I actually just looked up the date, it was November 22nd, 2000. If folks who are old enough to remember that, or folks who don't have read about it, but it was called the Brooks Brothers riot, right? I think that moment is absolutely like crystal ball for what we're going to look at now. And also, just to say what the Brooks Brothers riot was, the I don't know, cleverly named event where a bunch of, I don't know, some people describe it as well-dressed. I describe it as, you know, upper middle class white people. Stormed into the Miami-Dade County canvasser's office and like, stop the election, or stop the recount. And it was engineered to look like it was just this uprising of people, when it was really an for the most part, an orchestrated Republican tactic of people who, things that they accused the left of a fair amount of paid activists. Right. Or what's that? The thing that all the alt-right kids wear? It's a British designer polo thing, which I can't remember. So we could call it that. But I actually think it's going to be. Sorry, I was just responding to something someone said in the comments. I really think it's going to be a LARPer, right? A LARPer alt-right. LARPer is live action role playing. These guys who dress up in like as much camo and, you know, Velcro gun straps and guns as they can. It's, you know, maybe we can coin it now, PRA exclusive. It's going to be the LARPer, you know, riot. I can't imagine that these three things, and if other people want to comment on it or think about it or lend your brains to this, that there's going to be a disputed area, right? I can't really think that that's not going to be Pennsylvania for a double negative. So it's very likely it's going to be Pennsylvania. I can't see the standby Proud Boys, the LARPers, the alt-right, and people call disaffected lone wolves, or use whatever word that begins with a T you want to call those people with guns that drive in places and terrify people. That those people aren't going to say, like, Trump said dead Mexicans are voting in Pittsburgh, let's go. And people are going to respond. I mean, all of the rhetoric and actual words have been said to prepare people for that kind of thing. All of the lies coming out of the administration and the amping up of these alt-right structures. And I'll say, someone actually was on a phone call today about something entirely different, but nothing is entirely different in our society today. And someone said, you know, these terroristic, right-wing, conservative, you know, neo-Nazi-esque. And I said, oh, you're talking about the Justice Department? And the person laughed and said, oh, I didn't mean that, but yes. But I thought I was being clever. But also, I think that when you have, I don't like using the term law enforcement because it isn't what they do, but let's use it now. When you have law enforcement in conjunction with these street militias, right? The brown shirt-esque people, that is a terrifying construct if we look at what happened in the Brooks Brothers riot. So I think those facts on the ground, this doesn't answer your question, but it sets up the facts for the question. That kind of a thing is going to happen. People are going to attempt to, Fred Perry is the designer. Apparently Fred Perry came out and said, we don't like alt-right people wearing our shirts. We're going to stop selling that shirt, so they can't wear them anymore. So kudos to the capitalist structure denying Nazis from wearing their shirts. So if those are the kinds of facts, brothers, on the ground, it certainly is going to be a condition where people are going to say, okay, they stopped this recount, or they didn't stop this recount. And those are going to be things that all of the lawyers are going to be like, there's a cause of action there. Left, right, and center, people are going to say there's a cause of action there. Like, this recount shouldn't have stopped. It should have started. The state has a right to do it. No, the county commissioner has a right to do it. No, the secretary of state has a right to do it. No, the legislature has a right to do it. Those are things that are going to get litigated, I would imagine, on a big and small level. And I think it is almost a certainty that they're going to get escalated to the United States Supreme Court rather quickly. It's hard to predict what those very specific issues are, whether it's a technicality in voting, whether it's what date mail-in ballots will be allowed, or what, many other things, right? The validity of, does a signature match a signature, or, was this, mail forwarded somehow, or did it come in at a too late date, or was it date that it was postmarked? Those things are going to be litigated undoubtedly, right? It's difficult to predict what they are, but the thing that we do know is the decision-making body that is final in its decision-making on that is almost a certainty to be the United States Supreme Court, because I don't think much of this is going to get litigated in a final decision-making place in state courts. I think that's incredibly unlikely. But I think given the new structure of the Supreme Court, that is a scary construct.
Thank you, Carl. That was a real emotional roller coaster. Before we move on from the election, which we can return to towards the end of the webinar, would anybody else like to weigh in on what you're expecting to see, how you're planning action? Stephen, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I hope everyone, if you have anything else to add, please do. But I just wanted to go back to Pennsylvania just for a second, and what the what we are seeing is in the Army of Trump campaign volunteer recruiting website, they're asking for people to come in using this militarized language. And one of the tasks that they are assigning and recruiting people to do is to take photographs and video at polling places and at ballot collection areas. Now, Fred earlier mentioned vote harvesting, where one person gathers together, or one organization gathers together a bunch of absentee ballots and takes them in. That is actually illegal in Pennsylvania. And this is precisely where we're going to see a lot of this quote unquote evidence, perhaps flooding into the Trump campaign and being used to try to overwhelm whatever courts of first resort or first appeal are going to have to look at this issue. And given the fact that this has to be done in a relatively quick timeline because of constitutional issues, and given the fact that we know that pro-Trump sections of the media active right have been very aggressive in using faked video, of using video that has been altered and photos that have been altered to try to either by so-called deepfake digital techniques or simply by creative editing. This is one way this could happen. Again, I agree certainly with Carl that we don't know. It's probably going to happen in a bunch of ways. I'm guessing that there is in fact a playbook already out there for all of the different ways the GOP and the Trump campaign might make these challenges, especially in Florida, especially in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I'd like to just quickly say that I think we have some, I think one thing that's important is to know that the packing of the courts that has happened to date is specifically about those nooks and crannies in the systems where lots of small things will add up to votes not getting counted. I think there are other parts of the government that are implicated by that. There are things that can happen at the level of the municipality, at the county level. There are entire groups of people whose job it is who do have like really dry, non-paid and some paid jobs, just certifying folks to show up in just these moments to make sure that the Board of Elections is doing their job, that there are jurisdictional questions around how a group of pieces of paper get from one place to another place. All of that stuff creates chains of information. And so I do think there are a lot of small fights that will create some damage if we're not focused on making sure that the governors, that the mayors, that the folks who are on point in some of those boards and committees, and mayors sit on a lot of things that are ad hoc until it really matters, are really focused on the idea that they should be making sure that it's a safe place to vote. Some of that also includes whether or not they are going to work with the police departments to make quality of life crimes things that push people into a system that will be flooded and unable to receive them, whether or not people will be jailed mercilessly for protesting, whether or not people will be put into the criminal justice system as a result of their various responses of this, legitimate and otherwise. So I do think that there are a bunch of gatekeepers at a couple of levels who will also have roles to play, and it'll be up to the local community to figure out, is this a villain or someone who's for the democracy, by whether or not they choose to act in the authority that's vested in them to either make it a safe place to vote or for a safe place for people to stay home. I also want to flag that there are folks, including homeless youth, LGBTQIA folks who live in transit housing and different people who are unhoused, who end up getting drafted into these kinds of activities because they don't have an alternative place to go. And whether or not congregating in places as an unhoused person becomes a crime, whether or not there are enough bathrooms in a COVID environment. I just think that there are a few different things happening at once that we need to be mindful of. And I know for our part in the climate sector, we've been thinking for probably 12 or 13 weeks about what it is we can do. And some of that is just alerting the climate voter who historically has not exercised the franchise. They read enough books so they don't have to get involved. So it's been our real work at 350 and 350 Action to focus on what are we doing with the 75% of climate voters who read about it so they don't have to do anything? Are we putting a fire under them? Are we making them phone bank in places where they need to? So looking at how we move from a passive understanding of what's happening in the system to active responsiveness and holding people accountable is a thing that I think is hugely important and will make the difference as all of these crevices get explored. Are the judges able to weigh in? Have they been approved of despite being rammed through the system? Are the supervisors and lieutenants and committees that weigh in on all of these pieces full of people who actually care about the results? So I think we all have more than enough work to do if we just monitor our local situations to make sure that it's on the up and up.
Thank you, Tamara. It's interesting to hear how you're mobilizing your specific constituency. Really interesting. With the dynamics of the election, as we've talked about, which may not produce a result for weeks, and questions around a new administration, whether it's a second term for Trump, a Biden administration, or an unlikely but possible turn of events, a Pelosi administration, PRA will be focusing closely on the next several weeks between Election Day and Inauguration Day, particularly if this period should become a lame duck period for President Trump and/or Congress. For our panelists, I would like to hear where your immediate attention will be focused following the election. What dynamics will you be looking for? Where do you see the organizing potential of the American people, be it on the right or against the right? And where do you want to focus people's attention between now and mid-January? Who would like to start us off with this answer? Fred, do I see you working on unmute over there?
I wasn't working on that, but I can. An awful lot of what will be happening, I mean, what we've been talking about so far are a lot of concrete possibilities, but an awful lot of what I was talking about earlier is about theater, about tone, and about narrative. And so for the kind of Christian right folks, the conservative Catholics and the conservative evangelicals that I tend to look at, this is more about trying to control the narrative. And some of it will be quite apocalyptic insofar as many of them have talked about Trump being a godly anointed figure, and that any differing with him is essentially to disagree with or oppose God. And so the idea of rallying people around the religiosity of the technicalities of an electoral situation is something we really haven't seen before on this level. So to the extent that there's been lots of ideological streams within the Christian right that have arrived at the apocalyptic moment that they've been talking about, how far are they going to take that rhetorically and in terms of their physical activities? I mean, I've sort of resisted the idea that very many of these people could become violent, but if they believe what they've been saying, could they get drawn into violent formations? Well, sure. I will be looking out for things like that.
Thank you, Fred. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Well, quite all right. That's what we're here for.
Would anyone else like to chime in between now on what you're thinking about between now and January?
So I think some of it we've referred to as in different parts of the group, counting every vote, like how many of us will have to say that and for how long. There are a couple of different windows where this is really going to matter. Some of it is election season, which is happening now and through the 3rd. Then it's what are all the folks who are positioned to as the in some of the more boring jobs as like a city council, magistrate, and mayor. With what are they going to be doing to make sure they're holding space for free, fair, and safe elections? And then thinking through how do we beat the drumbeat for folks that this will not happen in 5, that there are no current examples of how long it will take for us to have the answers about who the executive of the country will be. So how do we make sure people are thinking about what's at stake for them? They are exercising more than a modicum of patience. This whole election cycle has been so specifically toxic and abusive. I think if you don't have PTSD, I would like to know what cave you've been hanging out in and if you have room for one more. So I do think people who are already damaged, whose nerves are already raw, who have been subject to financial violence and the taking away of every basic thing that you could count on, and then who can't even go to their safe spaces without being fed various lines of political rhetoric. I do think that there's psychological safety that will have to be tended to. People will have to focus on what we are fighting for. In my case, it's mostly about the climate future and really focusing on what the next generations will have handed down to them if we get tired now. So some of that will be public education and popular education on the issues that we care about the most, to remind people that that's what we got in the voting booth for. Really reminding folks that this is the first of many conversations you have to engage with your government to get it to deliver for you. Reminding folks that you drop a vote like a marker. He says that I care and I will be engaged, and then working through various formations to help people stay focused on that when it gets demoralizing. Because just to flag that, like, this could go on from November to January, and there are 2 public holidays which will not happen in the way that they are normally observed in the popular culture, and people will say, I'm tired of this, I just want to eat my dry turkey, so just to flag that, like, for people for whom these are markers of time, people will feel adrift from the things that feel more normal. And it's the job of those of us who care about good information, fighting disinformation, and keeping people tethered to reality, that we continue to raise the flag that, like, none of this is normal. You are not crazy. We need to keep moving.
Thank you, Tamara. Carl, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was going to take the very dangerous position of disagreeing with Tamara on one thing, completely respectfully. There's one thing, and I hold this, right? There's one thing that happened this year that is absolutely glorious. That is one of the most wonderful things I've ever seen in my life. I'll say it is probably politically one of the most wonderful things, if not the most wonderful. 10 to 20 million people took to the streets and said, Black women and Black queer people and Black folks in general should be free. And we're sick of this. I'll say it frankly, we are sick of this shit, right? In ways that would absolutely, if we went back to 1999, I mean, excuse me, 1999, I'm old, 2019, the last day of 2019 said, this thing's gonna happen. Both of us, we were like, oh, hell no. There's no way that's gonna happen. Black people were literally across this country. The Movement for Black Lives, people should go and look at this video. The Movement for Black Lives on their Instagram page has a video, and it's a compilation of South Africans doing the Toi Toi in protest in Soweto many years ago. And they mix it in with that music and some trap hip hop of Black folks dancing in the street in Oakland, in Washington, DC, in Detroit, in New York. I'll say in Oakland it's better, but we might have to argue about that. Someone's gonna say in Baltimore. Baltimore's there too, they got it. And if you explain to an alien that there are Black people dancing in the streets with other folks while all of this is going on, and I say, because that's actually the cracks. That's what it would look like if we lived in a country, in a world where people were free. That is what it looks like. And anytime I get really upset, I literally go back, I click on that video and go, it's breaking. This is what it looks like when it's breaking, right? So there's really one of 2 things is gonna happen, right? I don't know which one, but I am filled with hope. And when those people, when 50,000 people, 100,000 people in New York, 50,000 people here, Philadelphia, like 75,000 people, 20 million people, according to the wildly progressive New York Times, 20 million people, the largest civil rights movement in the history of this country. We can have whatever we want. We just need to ask for it. There's more of us than there are of them. And even if they got guns, organized people will always beat organized money. And I'll dare to say, and it's scary to say it, organized people will also beat organized guns. There will be violence, and it terrifies me. But if we believe that we can win and we properly mobilize, which we have been doing, we will always win, no matter what. And I'll say voting, people are going to get mad at me for this. Voting is the least important day in a democracy. Counting those votes, what we do all of the other time. And we have been doing that, right? We have been doing that, and people have been in the streets and people have been organizing. So I think there's a lot to hope for, but it's a roll of a dice, and we're waiting to see what what comes up.
I'll just add, we aren't in disagreement. I'm super
excited. I knew we were.
I love to be beta. I'm super excited about the joy that we have seen and that we will see. I do think that there are whole squadrons of people going out specifically for that purpose, who cast their votes already, and all they're doing is going out there to encourage other people. You can do this, drink this water, here's some PPE, let me teach you the electric slide. Like that is a set of decisions that people have made to put their bodies on a line in the creation of space that is psychologically safe. So I do think it is an exciting moment. It's just very different looking than the things you might see in the canons of how this work has been done. So much of it has been focused on solidarity that looks politically respectful and makes people feel like you can express your humanity by fitting in close to their design about what humanity looks like. And I think this version of it is much more about just experiencing joy and pleasure activism and being a human and reaching people as other humans. So I'm going to join you in being joyous, even though it's crazy times.
Thank you, Carl and Tamara. That's a wonderful high note for an otherwise somber conversation, and a great thing to redirect our attention back to, especially as we get closer to a period that looks very uncertain. Sticking with the chronology that we've been talking through, moving past, projecting out past Inauguration Day 2021. What movements on the right are worthy of our unceasing attention? This is a question, I think, in part for the PRA team, that are posing a continued threat regardless of the electoral outcome, regardless of the electoral process, and where will we likely see a continued erosion of democratic institutions? And then where do we look for the strengthening of these institutions? While this is a very broad question, I want to get a sense of what you all as strategists and movement leaders are invested in and focused on in the coming years. Who would like to start us off?
I can say a few words and maybe queue up some other folks to jump in, because I think we look at sets of movements, some of which are driven primarily by money and by thought leaders who have an outsized impact, but they don't have the numbers, the demographics for pushing agendas. And so we see a right-wing intersectionality between economic libertarianism, which exerts given the trivial number of people who actually have libertarian views, at least in any kind of consistent way, and the policy impact that these folks have, whether it's by mobilizing people who are concerned about their own economic welfare, and somehow buy into this idea that if we shut down coal mines in eastern Kentucky, that everyone's going to be out of a job and there's nothing that can be done. Or whether we're talking about folks on in the Christian right, coming out of the evangelical or right-wing Catholic world, who are worried about quote unquote religious liberty, or wanting to have the kinds of social organization that makes them most comfortable. Or whether we're talking about quote unquote law and order or immigration. These are forces where people are mobilized around oftentimes politics of resentment. So what I see as the spots where we want to pay particular attention is where you have large scale forces like climate change or demographic change or automation, where those intersect with money politics around economic libertarianism, and then can bring in some kind of resentment of immigrant others, resentment of people who are protesting on the streets because they have to drive around the protest, whatever justification. The actual harm that is done to people is oftentimes completely invented and other times exaggerated beyond view. But it's this that gives us the votes to have the support in Congress to pass a $3 trillion tax cut brought along by former Speaker Paul Ryan, who didn't really care about issues like immigration. I mean, he would have been just as happy to have more brown gardeners in the country to exploit. But he was willing to make that deal with the Make America Great people in order to get his tax cut. And the tax cut is forever. We can't regain that ground in a literal sense. It's already been lost. We can transform where we're going. We can make a change of course, but that and the systematic destruction of the capacities of the government itself, which is accelerating in this period, and which is another thing we should look for during the interregnum, attacks on the civil service and the regulatory apparatus, which again is going to take a long time to rebuild, just like with the courts. So it's at these intersections that I'm most concerned.
Thank you, Stephen.
Going forward, and I made brief reference to this earlier, and that's the idea that the Christian right and their allies are not focused on paramilitaries and violent revolutions so much as they are mastering the mechanics of electoral politics and the institutions of democracy themselves in order to impose their agendas. And they are better at it than any other section of American society, including the party professionals. Because they have a transcendent religious vision that animates them. Some of it's crass opportunism in politics and other human features too, but nevertheless, the religious vision not to be underestimated of profound, transformative notions of conservative Christian dominion. Sometimes they call it Christian nationalism, but it's an international vision. It's not limited to this nation, but it begins here to utilize the power available from this uniquely powerful nation is what's underway right now. Donald Trump may very well pass from the scene this time. He's a very flawed figure, but that isn't going to stop the profoundly anti-democratic movement that is manipulating American democracy and its institutions for their theocratic aims. That said, I agree with what was said earlier, and that is there's more of us than there are of them. The idea for them has been able to use well-organized minorities in order to achieve effective representative majority control. But the way that they do that isn't limited to voter suppression. It is across the board engaging individuals and institutions to expand their electoral capacities to achieve their aims. This is the historic thing that we've witnessed with the arrival of the Trump administration and what we will continue to see after Trump is no longer there, whether it's in 4 years or 8, if we still have an electoral democracy. That is what they've been organizing for and training for all these decades. It's going to take time, not just to repair, as Stephen said, our democratic institutions and regulatory apparatuses, but for the rest of us to catch up with using the knowledge and the skills and the tools that are still available to us of electoral democracy in order to adequately empower the majority who we actually are. So that's what I'm looking forward to in the next little while, is where we begin to really get that vision and to act on it quickly. Because like I say, there's more of us than there are of them, and we have the resources to do this.
Thank you, Fred. While you're on the topic, can you talk a little bit about the pro-choice religious movement project that you've been working on in this context?
Sure. The pro-choice community has seen the writing on the wall for Roe v. Wade for some time, and with the new justice, it seems all but definite that Roe v. Wade will be overturned in the not too distant future. So, what then would access to reproductive care and abortion then be in the future? Is one piece of it, but also what then do you do politically to try to restore what's been lost and to advance the cause once you're there? And trying to figure out the politics of that is very challenging. And it's not limited to thinking about matters of law. So I was tasked with looking at, well, is there a pro-choice religious community, and what, if anything, they could do? And it turns out that there is a vast pro-choice religious community in the United States with historic roots, major Christian denominations, most of organized Judaism, have formal theological positions that are pro-choice to varying degrees. Polling over the past 25 years consistently shows that the majority of Catholics are pro-choice, their leadership notwithstanding. A majority of mainline Protestants, and the overwhelming majority of Jews. So, but this is true across many other kinds of religious, minority religious affiliations as well. But the thing is, it's never been organized. It's even barely acknowledged to itself. The prevailing narrative in the country is that, well, religious people are anti-abortion and secular people, are pro-abortion. But in fact, it's much more complicated than that. But as you look at the historic religious dimensions of American society and who they are overwhelmingly pro-choice, probably either majority or near a majority of all religious people in the United States.
Thank you, Fred. Sticking with sort of a heartening look at a way forward, I want to ask the rest of our panel, what are some of the strategies, strategic priorities, and cross-movement collaborations that will counter the anti-democratic movements and events that are in progress today?
So one thing I think has to happen, because we're in this multi-generational part of the work, is admitting that the democracy is not working. And then helping people to recognize that we have two options. We can start again, or we can try to grab from these embers some stuff to work with as we start to fashion what we will be able to live with and survive. So I do think there are a couple of different efforts. In the climate space, the focus on the Green New Deal, as much as it has become the lightning rod for just about everybody in terms of whether you want to see all evil and all good in the policy space, I do think jobs, infrastructure, and human health will be paid for regardless of what you call it, right? So flagging that huge sums of resources will have to be moved into and out of the government in order to make change means people have to believe that that is possible. So a lot of the work, even in this moment, is about helping people to recognize that the current failures of an indignant, violent, and extractive government are not the only features of government. So there's some information gathering and sharing, some educational things that will have to happen just to move from the moment we're in into a moment where people are less traumatized and less debilitated, and they're going to need to be resources that follow that.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on this on a high note, another high note? Carl, I want to ask you, what's the way forward for the judiciary?
It's difficult. I think one of the things, just in answering your larger question, is I think it's hard for people to see right now much past the election. Like visioning past the election is inauguration, and it's like that's the far distant future. In some ways, rightfully so, right? Like if someone chops my arm off, I'm like, I'm gonna die. I need to get this fixed. And I think that's how many organizers, many activists, many regular people who are checking the polls every like 5 seconds are feeling. So I think it's difficult to see that. But if we do, like if we sort of, let's ignore the fact that there's an election going on right now. Impossible to do, but let's push that under the rug for a second. I think organizing that's been happening, I mean, solidarity that I've seen, and I was previously, we had a chat about this before the discussion started, but I work for the Water Protector Legal Collective for last year and some of the year before, and the solidarity that's happening with Arab and Muslim folks, Palestinians, indigenous people, and Black folks organizing in this country. I mean, that is unbelievable, right? That's people who are in really, really rural areas, indigenous people in cities, Black folks across the country, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim folks, and their allies organizing together, saying like, this is what settler colonialism looks like. This is what white supremacy looks like, right? So the Movement for Black Lives is doing that. The Water Protector Legal Collective is doing that. An organization that I worked with in the past and have an enormous amount of respect for, the Red Nation, which is a group of indigenous folks organizing nationally who have come out with actually a Red New Deal, which is in some arguments, a more progressive vision than the Green New Deal. That organizing is amazing. It's and some things that Fred was just talking about. It's what the right has been doing. Getting people together who a lot of times say like, well, I'm working on my issues and they're really dramatic to me and I don't really agree with you. But that's what happened in the Reagan Revolution, right? People got these groups of people together, right? The organized Christian right and business interests who like mostly would not really like each other, right? And free marketeers put them all together in one bin and they said, we love Reagan. That sounds great to us. We want to do this thing. And that, to a further extent, I mean, many of those people are the people who think, Donald Trump is the second coming. So I think that organization is one that I don't want to say emulate, but we should say, look, they're doing that. And we need to do that in a different way on the progressive left. As for the judiciary, the outcome of what has happened. So I think Merrick Garland is a really good example. The nominees that for lower level federal courts that Barack Obama put into place, if we looked at the politic of those people, they were generally, I mean, by world standards, they're centrist or center right people, many of them, right? That Barack Obama put on federal courts. If we were going to tag the people that Donald Trump has put on federal courts, he's not saying, let me get a centrist person. He's getting he's doing two things. He's getting the youngest people he can so they can be on the courts for as long as possible. And he's getting the rightmost people he can to put on these courts. And I think as the Green New Deal is an exemplar, right? And as the so-called squad is an exemplar, we need to be pushing the Democratic Party to say, like, why don't you stand up, pull your pants up, put your boots on, and act like a person who is working for liberation of people, act like a person who is on the left, and stop moving to the center, because you can win there, right? You can win there.
Thank you.
And I think that should also just in the end to tie it in is we should be doing that for the courts, right? Many people have said people should be doing what the Federalist Society has done and said, here are a list of people who are progressive people who should be on the courts, right? And that really hasn't been done writ large with a lot of progressive agreement for when Democrats are in power.
Yeah, I would just add that I would be thrilled to see people who read on the courts. I've often been asked about, are we in a fight of ideologies? I feel like that would require the opposition to have ideas. So super excited to get back to that. I would like things to be boring and full of people with opinions based on facts and ideas and ways of working in the world and a vision that supports that. Like, we are not currently in a contest of ideas, and that feels like a norm we need to get back to in order to have the progress that we are looking for. Like, just a boring old campaign run on probably some ideas someone considered based on people they want to support.
I'll throw in one little bit of future good news as well. Over the past few years, there's been after we exposed it, there was this state legislative project of the Christian right called Project Blitz. And we got a hold of their organizing manual and their 20 or so model bills that they were implementing around the country. And one of the things that was most interesting about it is that they had very consciously studied their own movement and tried to learn from their own experiences, best practices, what were our mistakes, how do we overcome them, how do we do it better, so that they could craft, here's the best thing we can come up with based on our existing experiences. And they put it together, complete with talking points, expected opposition talking points, who to look out for and how do you respond to things. It was a brilliant document, but we exposed it and it catalyzed a very unusual coalition of people. We call the Blitz Watch Coalition, and you can Google that. And it's a couple of dozen groups, American Atheists and PRA and American Center for Separation of Church and State, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, lots of LGBTQ rights groups, the National Women's Law Center. And all these groups that tend to have a siloized approach to issues came together to look at the also siloized vision of what Project Blitz was doing, but seeing that their vision came together with as different pieces of a dominionist theocratic vision. So people could rally together and compare each other's issues in opposition to what Project Blitz and to expose it. And it's been very successful. Yeah, the other side got legislation passed where they could, but they were stopped in a lot of places too. But the public pressure and an opprobrium and negative media coverage has been so profound that they've basically gone underground. Project Blitz, you can't find any record of it on their own website anymore. And its leaders at the state legislative level no longer acknowledge they're even a part of it. So we need to understand that there is possible to find new ways to do politics with unusual and perhaps surprising relationships in response to the new era we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Fred. I'm gonna ask for any last comments, but I think, we've 5 days before an election that I think is filling many of us with a lot of anxiety. This has been a really great note to end on. I think you've heard it here. The coalition building is our way forward, taking a page of the book, of the rights book, thinking about intersectionality in our work is what's going to get us there. And I would be loath to continue our conversation that takes us back into our sort of dark, worst nightmares. And so if anybody else would like to jump in with a last comment, I welcome it. This has been a really, interesting, dynamic, and diverse conversation. Well, great. Thank you so much.
I can just jump in and say that very briefly, I think there are things that we're going to need to do: rebuild, repair, and be willing to restart some conversations. What we have come to is the end of a specific form of design, and we're going to have to engage in some building of new agreements in order to get to the next place. Even if the system worked, even if the system wasn't designed to specifically leave out huge swaths of people, it could be arguable that that design doesn't match where we're going. So just setting aside all the problems there, I do think if we're not down to build new agreements based on what we have now, we will not be able to move forward. I think accountability is going to be a huge part of that, because you cannot solve people's problems if you do not admit that they have been harmed. So I think we're going to be looking at care and repair and seeing that through the level at the level of institutions, really focusing on rebuilding in the image of what the future should look like and not what the past made people feel. And then recognizing that what was built before just didn't work for enough people. So I think if we can keep our eyes focused on that, then we won't have to have fights about whether or not we should move off of coal, oil, and gas, right? Because what we'd actually be focused on and whether or not is what kind of world we're delivered to if that keeps happening. We won't be focused on whether or not a small number of rich people get to keep their money if we're envisioning what the future would look like if we continue on that trajectory. So I think we could get a lot out of a lot of positional fighting and into some really great design with some strange bedfellows if we just started to build backward from what it is we want to have to count on for the next few generations. And I can't imagine that we're going to be doing that without the folks who have been on the opposition.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Carl, Fred, Stephen. This has been a great conversation. I do feel better moving into next week, and I hope that people who are with us today feel that way as well. This is our last webinar of this season, so stay tuned for future public programming from PRA. We've shared several resources in the chat, and we'll be sharing them in a follow-up email. So some reading to get you through the next few days and to inform your resistance. That's what we're here for. Thank you again all for joining us today.